Good evening, everyone. Tell Me Your Story welcomes you to the stories of floods and displacement under TMYS review September 2021. We are calling for submissions of stories, essays, and poems as a part of the project. Today, we are very privileged to have Dr. Arupjyoti Saikia and Dr. Prasun Chatterjee to discuss the moods and mess of the Brahmaputra with reference to the book The Unquiet River, authored by Dr. Saikia. Professor Arupjyoti Saikia teaches history at Indian Institute of Technology, Guwahati. His book, The Unquiet River, a biography of the Brahmaputra, published by Oxford University Press in 2019, had been shortlisted for Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay Book Award for 2020 and is listed among the honorable mentions for the Anandok Kentish Kumaraswamy Book Award organized by the Association of Asian Studies for 2021. Prasun Chatterjee is a historian and senior publishing professional. His last assignment was as the editorial director of Pan Macmillan India, where he focused on trade publishing, and previously he had spent a decade at Oxford University Press, commissioning works of academic excellence. Prasun is now completing his manuscript based on his PhD thesis on 17th century European travelers and their narratives in South Asia, and writing a chapter on alcohol and its uses in India from ancient times to the colonial era for a Bloomsbury UK book on Indian cuisine. I now hand it over to Prasun to take the conversation ahead. Thank you, Prasun and Professor Shaikia, for joining us this evening, and I look forward to a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Coral, for introducing us. And my warm welcome to Professor Arupjyoti Saikia to this very promising session, very interesting one that we got invited to. I have had the privilege of being Professor Saikia's editor at Oxford University Press, and we have many wonderful memories discussing his book, The Unquiet River, which is his latest one. But I also remember his first book on ecological and history and forests in Assam coming out in my early years at OUP. His other book, Century of Protests, has found equal acclaim among academics and historians. And before we begin, Professor Saikia and I would like to put in a joint disclaimer. So I would like to invite Professor Saikia to speak those words and then take the discussion ahead. Professor Saikia, please.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Chatterjee, and thank you, Coral, for inviting us. It is definitely a very happy privilege, and we thought that this is such an is a very painful time across the world, and in India too. In particular, we have seen the devastation, and Coral has invited us, and she has rightly said that we need some distraction from this time, and we thought that this is what we can do by engaging, by talking about the nature, about the river, about the water, about so many things, and this can be our duty and responsibility to this moment of crisis. I think this is how we can go ahead with this. Right. Thank you, Dr. Chatterjee.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Saikia. Yes, this is a very difficult time as I speak from Delhi, and where the pandemic is at its worst. So very difficult times, and our topic also kind of resonates with that. So putting in this thought that there are many people who are suffering at this moment, we will continue our discussion. Professor Saikia, it's been really interesting to follow your work over the years. So my first question, something which I've been intrigued with for quite some time, have not really had the time to ask you about this, but I see that in all your works, right from the beginning, all your works mainly on the northeast of India, um, the books are, the research is intertwined with ecological concerns and human settlement, the links of these. And there is a huge component of deep thought about ecology and its linkages with history. So, could you tell us a bit more about your vision of the region and its links with the Brahmaputra River, and how it might have brought you to your last project, a very big one on a complete history of the Brahmaputra River? Process Saikia.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Chatterjee. I think you can notice this my engagement with this the intertwined questions, right, of the humans and the nature in the progress of the historical forces or historical processes as it has developed in this region, right? I think no one can escape in these regions the questions of nature and its relationship with the humans, right, and the non-humans. Yeah, you cannot essentially escape the elephants, tigers, or rhinos. They do live uh, largely in secluded territories, but they're so interconnected. In fact, you know what I feel that when you arrive, when you land in the Northeast India, nature will continue to seize you, right? They will be after you continuously. For example, the trees, the rains, the monsoon, very short dry spell, then the very short moderate winter, then the voices of frogs, probably the birds, right, or the dust from the Brahmaputra. They're our part of life and the imagination. You cannot simply ignore them. They're so well connected, right? If you walk around in the night, you hear these voices of the frogs, the jackals, right? Foxes, right? Or somewhere the voices of monkeys, right? Everything is there continuously. The shadows of long trees, or the bamboo shades, right? Everywhere they are so well present, right? They are deeply ingrained in the imagination and the life of the humans of the northeastern India. So how can I ignore them? I cannot simply ignore them. But as a historian, I has a different role to play. You know, I need to see as a historian that how the trees and the rivers, so many rivers in these regions, are so closely connected. They are interwoven with the lives of this region, right? That I, as a historian, cannot ignore them, and others also cannot ignore them. A layman or maybe a recent traveler to this region will may not be persuasively impressed by these fishers, right? By the trees, the frogs, the birds, right? Or the rivers, or the trees, right? So many varieties of trees. You don't see only one varieties of trees, right? Uh, they may not be impressed by them, but those who are living here, right? They cannot simply ignore them. For a recent a newcomer, everything looks like maybe a very flat region, right? Or occasional appearance of hills of very low height. But you know, we cannot simply ignore the Himalayas or the Patkais, which surrounds the settings of the northeastern India, and we cannot simply refuse their presence. So, if we accept those natural features, the Himalayas, the monsoon, those hills, mountains surrounding the western Burma, right, and the hills of Meghalaya and then other regions, right. Uh, They tell the stories of this region. And then we see that how well connected these natural features, then the human settlements, forest and the rivers. All human actions are essentially driven by these natural features. Mountains, the monsoon, the blue skylines, right? The rivers, the water bodies, the flat plains, right? Everything actually interconnects the human life here. As a historian, I have a responsibility to examine all this beyond a very traditional and the conservative archives, to see these human and the non-human lives and the forest and the rivers. Then I feel that they are the most forceful forces which shape our lives, our economies, societies, and probably more importantly, the human compassion, right? In at least today's time, we cannot simply ignore the question of human compassions. Probably all these forces play a very, very important role in deciding these forces that I just mentioned to you. Uh, Probably this, let me repeat it, I think these economies, the societies, the polities, and the human compassion all together, right? In fact, every animal, whether they are tigers, and the elephants, rhinos, jackals, right, the monkeys, right? I can only name a few. They're so closely connected with these interconnected the natural systems, then that one can hardly refuse to ignore all these processes. But as a historian, who is interested in understanding in the making of the British Empire in the northeastern India and also the previous political systems. I realized that the trees, the plants, the seeds, the rivers, they played an important role, right? In shaping the destiny of all these economies and the political system previously. Whether it was the British Empire, you cannot simply ignore the role that the trees and the rivers played. And more importantly, I thought that the economies of those times, the British time, the pre-British era, everything survived on the use and the exploitation of these natural endowments. If I refuse to recognize these forces, I will fail as a historian. And I think these are the concerns which I thought that are really important in 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 helping me in grappling with these forces together collectively, right? Rivers, waters, the land, and the trees, right? Animals, right? I think all these things collectively shape the destiny of me, my future generations, and also the discipline that I'm part of is, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
I have been able to explain your this very important question, but this is what I thought that this may be a starting point to discuss our conversation, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, Professor Saikia, I think your explanation has been just very apt to begin this discussion on two counts. One is the historian's craft, which you have just sort of alluded to, and which is very important for people from other disciplines to understand as to how a historian looks at the entire ecology, atmosphere, and every evidence that they can find, to be sensitive to that and at the same time be critical to them. But on the other hand, you just sort of, in the first part of what you were describing, you brought alive my memories of the first 15 years of my life, which were spent, as I have at times shared with you, in a small town, in two small towns actually in Assam, in Abhayapuri and Bongaigaon. Abhayapuri especially is picturesque, and though it does not, like in Guwahati where you stay, where the Brahmaputra flows by, though it does not flow by this small town called Abhayapuri, but we had enough water bodies around, and elephants and jackals and other animals. And I was transported to that atmosphere all of a sudden when you were speaking. And at times as a child, I had wondered that, the elephants who come on the roads and cross by when the jeeps, in those days, this is the early 80s that I'm talking about, they would stop at night and switch off their lights. So where did the elephants come from? It's a child's sort of way of looking at it. But also now when I wonder, since when has this been going on, this crisscrossing of um human and animal lives? So that brings me actually to my second question, uh, that over the years we know, and we think that Brahmaputra river has molded the lives of people in Assam. But if you could tell us a bit more about the earliest traces of this. Your book, I know, deals with this interaction of humans and animals around the river system, and the crucial part of the river system in the occupations and lives of flora and fauna. So, if you could sort of tell us a little bit about human displacement and resettlement from the prehistoric times to more recent times, it would give us a sense of the long history of humans with nature around this very important river system that is Brahmaputra. Uh,
Okay, thank you, Dr. Chatterjee. I think you are right that everyone who lives in these regions, they do have a very sharp and very engrossing memories of those the natural world, right? No one can escape the voices and the sounds of those dark nights, full of the voices of frogs, jackals, right? Everything is there, right? And you are absolutely right about that. My book has some indications of, or some summaries of what we know about this early pattern, right? Uh, you know, uh, Let me admit these things very fast before we discuss this point in detail. The archaeological research on these regions, right, which has definitely broadly of the colonial time and particularly of the 1960s onward, right? There are leading archaeologists of these regions or on this region. They have definitely done some wonderful work. They have helped us in just understanding the broad patterns about the early human settlements, say the early Neolithic settlements, which they roughly suggest about 4,000 to say 1,000 before Christ, right? This is the time period that they normally talk about. This is largely the Neolithic age that they are more interested in. But what this informs us that this is about the settlements in the hills or settlements in the far remote areas away from the hills, right? For example, settlements in the Meghalaya, settlement in the Kachar Hills, or not Kachar Hills, or Karbi Hills, right? Those are the stories that we do have a very clear picture about that. I'm very sure that in future, my generations or future students on archaeology, they will do more uh, interesting works, interesting research with more institutional support, and their research will tell us more clearly about the broad patterns about the early human settlements. Now the resources on the genetic resources on language, food, right, settlement, everything is becoming so well developed, right? I'm sure that future stories will tell us more clearly about this time period, the 4,000 to 1,000 time period. But at least we know we do have some clarity, right? These clarities are still hazy, they are still foggy, they are not still very clear, but we know that settlements happen more organized along the hills, or on the hills, or in the foothills. This is what we know about, right? Roughly between 4,000 to 1,000 before Christ. This is the time period that I'm talking about. But in the subsequent time, right, the post 1000 BC, right, from the say 600 BC or 700 BC, right, this time period, we do have more clarity about many things, about settlements, about land uses, and these are largely driven from the great volume of inscriptions that were discovered throughout the 20th century by scholars of Bengal, scholars of Assam, the British scholars. They have all contributed to a solid corpus of archive to give us a clarity of research. So, what do we know about those things? Uh, we clearly know about that there are more river-based settlements. People were coming. There are floods. We know that there are about the paddy cultivation, which is the most dominant crop in these regions. These regions, the valley, Brahmaputra Valley and Kachar Valley, the valleys, they don't go for maize, bajra, or the other kind of crop that we are so familiar with in other parts of the country. These are not produced. We know about their settlements. We know about the people, right? We know about the resources, the cattle, the bullocks, right? All these things are very, very clear. But we don't have stories of what you are thinking, right? What you are asking for, the stories of displacement or resettlement, right? I think those stories cannot be constructed or thought about based on the kind of evidences we do have now. This clarity about the the forceful, right, the moving out of people from one locality to another locality, this happened largely in the last millennium, right? Say, to give you a very concrete example, um, say around the 13th century onwards, right? Roughly some 800 years before, right? 700 years before, right? We do have a very clear stories, clear picture about what exactly happened during this period of time. I'm not saying that in the earlier period, these things did not happen. But unlike many other historical experiences of other societies, like the Chinese or the Egyptian societies, or even Southern Indian societies, our historical evidences are still very, very poor, right? Unless and until future archaeologists give us a much more concrete, elaborative answers. But from the 13th century onward, uh, we do have stories of displacement and the settlement. But this definition of displacement, resettlement, right, or the floods, this cannot be equated with our modern definitions of flood, displacement, or the resettlement, right? They cannot be a typical definition of displacement. Uh, but rivers and their floods, at that time also did not allow any kind of permanent settlement, right? They will not allow you, right? The way it happens today, right? In fact, even you cannot you cannot think of settling very close to the rivers. Let me again repeat these things. The reason do not have only one big river. There are many, many powerful big rivers. Uh, mm, some are tributaries, some are independent, right? All rivers have their equal temperament, equal histories, right? And equal ecological rules. Many are the rivers coming down from the Himalayas. Some are from Meghalaya, some are from the Patkais, right? All rivers have, and their destinies are primarily towards the Bay of Bengal, right? They all flow down uh, through the modern Bangladesh to the Bay of Bengal. They carry so many things, right? And that is a different story. But what I'm trying to answer your question that uh, these rivers and their floods, right? They also experienced, the 13th century people also experienced floods, right? But those experiences were definitely different. But one thing was very sure: they hardly encouraged permanent human settlement along the courses of the river. That can be very clear. Of we have some of the very well-known events and some of the very well-known evidences, which can be safely described as the stories of displacement of different scale and nature from the early 13th century. For example, that of the future Ahom rulers when they arrived in eastern Assam in the early 13th century. In fact, they arrived in the early 13th century, and for the next very roughly 2 centuries, right? Next 2 centuries, they were always seized by floods and the changing river courses. In fact, they were unable to find a permanent capital or a seat of governance for the Ahom rulers who kept on moving from one place to another, precisely in search of a better place to live in because they were safe. However, one thing is very clear that the kind of trade perceptions they have, the kind of worries they have, they are structurally, fundamentally, they are different from the 21st century's experience of floods, right? They are not displacement that are caused by the big dams, or they are not displacement caused by other modern developmental projects, right? These are much more nature induced, right? And that's why for a long period of time, during those era, the 13, 14, 15, 16 centuries, right, the people choose not to come closer to the rivers. They thought that it is better not to be closer to the rivers. There was a kind of the buffer zone, or there is a kind of Lakshman Rekha, right, which you should cross or you should not cross. Then, can we assess this or can we quantify these losses when people moved out from one locality to another locality? Probably in terms of economies, it will be difficult to assess because we don't have those solid archival records for those period of time. But there was obviously great political consequences, political and the cultural consequences. There were so many experiments of moving out, right? And also, this helped the people, the rulers particularly, to know and appreciate the nature more clearly, closely. Because until and unless you appreciate, and you understand these natural systems, obviously, the time period that I'm talking about, the people, they were unfamiliar with the modern geology, right? The techniques, the methods, or the philosophies of the modern sciences, they were not aware of in that sense. But still, they were trying to understand the forces and the dynamics of the nature, rivers, right? And this understanding helped them not to make permanent houses, not to have the agricultural fields very close to the rivers. However, over a period of time around the 17th century, roughly 300 years from now, before, right, there were compulsions. You need to produce more crops. There are more mouths to feed, right? There are wars. All combined together, compel the people or the rulers of the time to come closer to the river, but to face the consequences. To overcome these traits of displacement, they began to do some early embankments around the 17th century. But those were really of tiny scale. These were not great, gigantic structures that came up. These were of really tiny, tiny things. So to summarize your the fundamental questions, whether we do have early evidences of displacement or resettlement, we do have largely of the last millennium, the second millennium AD. But before that, the stories are still very fuzzy, right? Or foggy. We don't have a very clear picture about that. I don't know whether I have been able to answer your
Yeah,
question.
yeah. Yes, Professor Saikia, I think a very clear thing that comes out from what you've just explained are the different rhythms of history in different eras and the different consciousnesses that people work with and sort of interact and intervene in their immediate ecologies. But if I were to ask you that, and since you mentioned a while before that, especially the British during their time, a lot of consciousness comes in about uh, the ecology, how to exploit that, if we were to say, how to bring things under control from floods to other things. So, how quick do you think the change in the ecology of Brahmaputra and its neighboring regions uh, has been in modern times, especially in the last 200-300 years? Is it drastically different from the pre-colonial times? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
You know, let us focus on the last 200 years, not last 300 years. 200 years would be far better in terms of the way the British Empire influenced and impacted the river and the human settlements. Right? I think they definitely played an important role. Uh, let us begin from a different directions. The river actually facilitated the entry of the British Empire, right? The river was the great the network, right? It facilitated the arrival of the British Army. It facilitated the dispersal of goods from these regions, including the timbers, right? Or the river facilitated the journey of a very modern idea, right? However, the 19th century experience of the Brahmaputra, the floods, with that of, say, the Ganga, it was strikingly different. It was different from different contexts. The Brahmaputra and the Ganga, if we compare in the 19th century, so many experiments were going on in the Ganga or Jamuna or farther west in terms of irrigation, in terms of the great canals, right? So many experiments were going on across Pan India. If you go to the south, there were really heroic experiments were going on. Ganga also, right? All the big canals were constructed at that time, right? And other interventions came in. Brahmaputra largely escaped those experiments of the 19th century um, because they thought that Brahmaputra is slightly untamable, it is too difficult, and it does not produce any result, right? To mix such a big technological, financial, and intellectual investment into a system, you also require some outcomes, and which did not happen in the 19th century for Brahmaputra. So it largely escaped the fate of dramatic transformations. Rather, the river actually became a companion to the empire's progress, empire's growth in this region. Several things happened. The river actually facilitated the millions of outflow of goods to the global market, whether it was the newly produced tea, the coal, limestones, timber, including probably rhino horn and elephant tusks, right? All those were actually extracted and they were made part of the global commodity market in the 19th century. However, there was obviously some basic changes in the ecology, right? The big transformations came, it was the large clearances of the timbers. the Northeast, except some localities, for example, the modern Arunachal Pradesh, partly modern Nagaland and Meghalaya, right? They escaped the timber exploitation in the 19th century but from the plains of these regions, the timber was heavily exploited. And this exploitation of the timber, right, and it has definitely produced different layers of impact on the floods, on the sediment level of the river, right, and the future changes in the flooding pattern, right. All this continued to happen. In fact, the intensity of the forest clearance continued to happen well into the middle of the next century. In fact, around the time of the Second World War, the entire Northeast saw the largest, probably, the clearances of forest, because those forests were needed to be cleared for making the routes for the Second World War, because this region was also the biggest theater of the Second World War. So the forest has to be cleared. Forest has to be cleared also for the military purpose. Why I'm saying that this massive, long-scale the forest clearances, this contributed to this, partly, we don't have a very clear answer about that, partly to the sediment layers of the Brahmaputra and other rivers, right? And these are at least the popular perceptions, partly correct, partly true, partly wrong. But then there are also the actual settlement. There are the more and more lands were cleared off, and these lands were cleared off for a very, very peculiar reasons. The lands were cleared and they were reclaimed for agricultural purpose, not for food production. These were for the production of jute, right? Jute. In fact, India was one of the highest producer of jute till the partition, till India's independence, and India was proud to be the biggest supplier of jute products also. It was one of India's highest the foreign earning till the mid 20th century, till the partition. So all collectively shaped the settlement patterns, right, in the plains of the Brahmaputra Valley and other places also. As more and more pressure was felt on the land, the impact of the flood was also felt now differently, right? The nature, the rivers, the water, it actually prohibited for a long period of time the then settlement pattern. And we have seen it historically, that how unlike the Gangetic Valley, right, the human settlements was much more thinner in these regions. And this thinness came out of this very volatile character of the nature. Very volatile, right? I'm using this word quite consciously. However, because of this imperial or rightly the colonial interventions, all these natural breaks or the barriers, they were temporarily brought to a temporary freeze, right? And the freezing of this, the human nature engagement, these historical experiences of a longer period of time, of the earlier period of time, it shattered human imaginations. You cannot cope up with the crisis, right? So suddenly, you were now forced to build embankments because your experience of flood was completely different from that of, they say, the 15th century, from that of the 16th century. So these changes, right, these new experiences of flood obviously compelled the people, compelled the government to build embankments. And the consequences of the embankments was very, very clear, right? This large-scale embankments, which were constructed from the middle of the 20th century, from around the 1950s onwards. It has political, economic, social, and environmental consequences. And people can actually see the differences. If you go and meet an elder, they will clearly tell you, oh, my time, my grandparents' time, they were so fine. We used to get good food, right? We used to get good quality of resources. We don't used to get it now. So if you go and meet any person who actually lament these stories of loss of fishes, right? Bengal, Assam, these are the places of their fish eaters, right? If you don't get good quality fish, right, you feel unhappy. Your hunger remains hunger, right? You, even if you are getting a fistful of rice, you still feel that, oh, you do not have a good feast. This absence of fish actually is directly connected to the flood, right? Because the embankments disrupted the regeneration of fish, and there are many varieties. Unless historians pay attention to these changes, which are obviously not recorded in the archives, they would not be part of any autobiographical account, right? Historians have to pay attention to these things, and that's why, your first question, why I'm so interested in this question of nature and the forest and the river together, and because they are so integral to it. Yes.
Yeah, this was fascinating, Professor Saikia, and to know about the different symptoms that came into the lives of people in modern times. Uh, and the more I think about it, I have also seen the Brahmaputra during the floods. We know that it floods every year, and the river bulges to almost 3 or 4 times its breadth, especially during the floods. So I was thinking that the local population, and especially when you talked about in earlier times the river basins, the proximity to the river was kept in mind, and the population was thinner over there. Is it the same case now, or is it a very different case where during modern times the population pressure has led people to build settlements nearby? And what is the impact of that? And also, what is because it's a place which gets flooded all the time. So what are the coping strategies of the local population around these areas? What are they facing now? If you could tell us a little bit about
You know, flood, obviously, it has many stories to tell, right? As a historian, or I will experience the flood differently from those who are actually the victims of the flood, right? Uh, you know, the experiences are different, the cultural, the environmental, and the community experiences for each and everyone is a different story altogether. But collectively, I feel and I think very strongly about it that for a long period of time, people did appreciate the flood uh, for its very, very imaginative role to play in the society and the environment. Flood was not a disaster. If you read all the 15th, 16th, 17th century, there would be accounts of disasters very, very infrequently. Say flood used to come, right? Say if you ask me to read a newspaper of say 1966, 1967, 1968, the months of June, July, August, there will be repeated stories of, in fact, flood caused devastation, flood caused devastation. In fact, this is the template that we use in our modern times. But our previous generations of the 16th, of the 15th, 17th centuries, their template was different because for them the flood came and it went off. The flood came and it went off almost like a rhythm, right? And they were obviously prepared for that. And that preparation was, there would be many, many examples. At least one example would be good. And this is true for even Bengal, right? There is the specific varieties of paddy, right? The baudhan, right? The bow rise, right? Which grow taller every inches of floodwater it comes, right? It actually tries to outsmart the floodwater. So this different cycle and the seasonal, right? This application of great mind of the plants, right? Your agricultural cycle to suit with the flooding time. I think that helped the people to overcome the food crisis. I'm sure that throughout the centuries there was flood, but we don't have major stories of flood related the famine, right? We don't have that stories of that. At least no oral memories, no historical records of the earlier period of time. They don't tell these stories. But suddenly, because of the change of the cropping pattern, because of the markets, because you are now producing different kind of crops, right? Right. All these things dramatically change your cropping pattern. But more important, that you asked one very important question: uh, the settlement pattern. The settlement pattern dramatically got changed in the 20th century. We now do have a very clear picture, and more of the last 40, 50 years, that the human settlement density, right, per square kilometer density nearer the river is much more compact than 40 years earlier, right? This compactness, this had actually this can cause much more material damage to the people, to the individuals, to the families, right? You are coming closer to the rivers, you are having settlements, and all your material, right, belongings can go off the wire, right, immediately because of the floods. But also because the embankments, floods do not come but do not go away now, right? They come because by breaking the embankments. Earlier, the floods used to come like a rhythm with a low intensity. Probably we don't know the clear. Sometimes the height might go in a different scale, but now quite frequently the flood comes by breaching these embankments, and there is a sense of false security. 1960s, 1970s, 1950s, there were repeated concern by the communities, by the people, that these embankments are essentially causing concern to us because flood comes. Because we are thinking it is almost like a modern vaccine, right? If you take a vaccine, then suddenly you are got caught by something. Your trust on a system or particular kind of philosophy, it settles, right? I think that precisely happened. Obviously, this metaphor does not apply to the embankment, but this is what exactly happened to the embankments of the earlier period of time. But people cope up in different ways. People cope up with not building the very concrete houses. For example, many dwellers inside the river, those river islands, people, they don't build gigantic houses, big structures, concrete structures. They build houses which can be made dysfunctional in an hours, right? And you can rebuild those houses in a short period of time. You can take your cattle and other material wells in a boat. Immediately you can transport to another safe locality. I think that temperament, right? This, you have that capacity to withstand the ferocity of the river. You have the capacity to understand or to fight back, right? Through different agricultural models, crops, everything together. I think it was a collective sense, right? It was not some uh, mm, part and parcel response to the flooding problem. It was not a problem per se. Best word would be in defense of flood, right? The flood came, it cleaned, it helped the fishes to get more places for its reproductions, right? It was a merry time, right? Merry-making time. Uh, However, obviously, because now floods comes with a different kind of political color, right? The floods are more political now, right? Unlike a natural flood. you're supposed to suffer more, right? And it has many, many political consequences to that.
Yeah, and that reminds me that the houses we used to see, the structures earlier near the Brahmaputra of houses on stilts, on structures which were high above the ground, they also perhaps seem to have disappeared. They are much less now, and these are more concrete buildings by the riverside, at least in and around Guwahati, from what I have observed. So definitely the settlement patterns have changed, and that's why people have perhaps lost that flexibility to remain one with nature and their surroundings. So, as a last sort of question,
You have actually best summarized my long explanation. Thank you so much, Dr.
and
Chatterjee.
and as a last question, I just thought, while researching for the Unquiet River, is there actually this different mentality and how it changed? Do you remember any very impactful narrative, of the lives of people you have interacted with in present times, or some fascinating story that you might have found in the archives which moved you, which show these, how these rhythms have changed of flooding and resettlement of humans and their understanding of nature. Would you like to leave us with something of that sort?
No, that will be very difficult to remember. But there are so many things. We live by the river, right? Um, you know, as I'm speaking now, probably some 300 meter, 300 to 400 meter to the right of me, there is a river. If I can go out, I can hear the thundering voice of the river. It is not too far from. But I know that this river has actually been traveled, or it was on these rivers, right? So many of our previous generations, say 15th century scholars, 16th century scholars who used to travel from other parts of the country, they were basically living on these rivers. Same was the story for the military warriors, traders like that. Those are definitely part of. But I used to grow up on a floodplain, right? Very close to my childhood, right? Very close to the river. Few kilometers, but these kilometers are not kilometers, right? Because during the flood, it became a sea, right? Your land and the river get connected. So it is actually during the flooding time that you feel this organic connection. It's almost like you are brought back to the basic organic self, right? I remember 1988. I completed my +2, and this was the year a devastating flood came in, and suddenly we realized that the embankment has broken, and probably in hours we have been asked to vacate our house. We never thought that this will happen, and we are taken off in a bus to the town. I lived in a village, so we were all packed off to a town refugee camp, the flood camp probably, and we don't know these places, right? It was a horrific experience. My father, he said no, he will not leave. He will leave in the flood. He will stay back at home. Those 2-3 days of night, it was a horrible experience. And then the government decided that they will give some boats to bring back the people who are still there in the villages, because they don't know about those experiences. And it was a midnight. It was a full moonlight day. I remember fully well. And we embarked on a boat, very tiny boat. We don't know the direction, which direction it should go. And the boatman was also a new one, but he had a clear idea which direction it should go. another friend of mine who is a school teacher now, and the boatman and myself, midnight on a moonlight day, full moonlight day, we embarked on this journey to bring back some of those villagers, including my father. And we obviously lost the route because it is a flood. It is an ocean, almost like an ocean, right? And so many incidents, so many things. We came and reached home, and we found each and every one amidst flood, knee-deep houses or flooded houses. Everyone was happy. Flood came suddenly, but everyone was happy because in the morning when we reached their house, people were basically going for fishing and all the merrymaking. This was the experience, merrymaking. They were really happy. And next day, we brought back the people, including my mother, my brother, and sister, from the camp, because people were happy to live with the flood. Right? This was of the 1980s stories. This story obviously does not fit into everyone's life, right? There can be terrible upset to every individual experiences, particularly more recent times when your crops are damaged, your houses are being damaged. But I think these childhood memories actually give me confidence of trust, my own trust with the river's future, and river's very effective role in making the modern Assam. I do have enormous trust on this river and its environment.
Thank you, Professor Saikia. I also remember the 1988 flood that you just talked about.
Oh,
And
okay.
I was obviously much younger, almost a child at that time. And we went to rescue some of our relatives from Dhubri. And that region also gets flooded a lot. So that brought
So
back
we have
some
one
there are
commonality.
common
We have
shared memories of that kind.
we have
Yeah.
one common
Thank
story:
you
the
for
rescuer.
rescuers.
Right.
Thank you for this fascinating sort of session and the
Oh,
recollections,
thank
the personal recollections at the end. So I give this over to Koral, having enjoyed the discussion a lot.
Thank you, Dr.
Yes, I was
Chatterjee.
listening about, I was listening the discussion from behind, and it was so fascinating. And especially Dr. Saikia, the last thing that you say, that I have immense trust on the river. Throughout the discussion, and especially the end point, actually takes the entire narrative of our project, which we were intending to do, it takes it away from the flood driven disaster to a human driven disaster, and gives nature the kind of respect that it should get, and tells people to take note of what it is doing and how it is spoiling. Thank you so much for bringing that narrative in. It really touched, and it was very insightful.
Thank you, Ms.
Uh,
Sankar. Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Chatterjee, for giving this
my
opportunity.
pleasure.
Thank you, Professor
Right.
Saikia.
Thank
Thank
you,
you for
Dr.
that.
Saikia, Dr.
Very nice.
Chatterjee, for the insightful conversation. And we look forward to receive submissions of stories, essays, and poems of displacement and rehabilitation of flood victims at the TMYS Review September 2021. Please do stay safe, drink warm water, and take good care. Times are bad. Please do take care.
Good
Thank
night.
you so much,
Good
all
night.
of you.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.